Sometimes the loneliest person in the room is the one everyone fears to approach. Sometimes the most powerful man in the world is also the most heartbroken. Emperor Tiberius ruled Rome with an iron fist, but a crimson scar across his face kept every potential bride away. No noble family wanted their daughter wed to a man marked by violence and whispered betrayal. He had everything, gold, power, armies, but sat alone each night, aching for someone to see him as more than a monster. Then Cassia came, a widowed healer with gentle hands and a kind heart. She looked past his scar and saw the tired soul underneath. Their love story began in silence and grew into something that could change Rome forever. Could their unlikely bond survive the schemes of senators and the threat of war? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the imperial palace, its golden light filtering through the tall columns that had witnessed the rise and fall of emperors for generations. Tiberius Lucianus stood at the window of his private chambers, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the bustling streets of Rome come to life below. The city stretched out before him like a vast tapestry, merchants hawking their wares, citizens hurrying to the forum, children chasing each other through the narrow alleys between towering insulae. All of it his domain, all of it under his protection and command. Yet as he stood there, master of the known world, a familiar weight settled upon his shoulders. The same weight that had pressed down on him for the past 7 years. Ever since that fateful day when he had claimed the purple and the burden of absolute power that came with it, his reflection stared back at him from the polished bronze mirror mounted on the wall, a face that had once been considered handsome by Roman standards, strong-jawed and noble, with eyes the color of storm clouds. But now that same face bore a mark that changed everything. A crimson scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, a jagged reminder of the battle that had won him the throne and cost him so much more than he had ever imagined. The scar itself was not the worst of it, though it served as a daily reminder of that terrible moment when his own brother had turned against him. Marcus, his younger brother by 3 years, had been his closest companion, his most trusted general, the one person in all the world he had believed would never betray him. They had fought side by side through campaigns in Gaul and Germania, had shared the brotherhood that only soldiers who have faced death together can know. But ambition had corrupted that bond. On the plains outside Mutina, as they prepared for what should have been their final victory against the last of the Republican forces, Marcus had struck. Not in honorable combat, but from behind, with a dagger meant for his brother's heart. Only Tiberius's reflexes, honed by years of warfare, had saved his life. The blade had caught his face instead, marking him forever. While his own sword had found its mark in his brother's chest, the physicians had done their best with the wound, but scars of the soul run deeper than those of the flesh. The mark on his face had healed, but the trust that had been shattered that day had never mended. How could he trust anyone when his own blood had sought to spill his? Caesar, the voice of his personal secretary, Lucius Maximus, interrupted his brooding. A thin, efficient man in his 50s, Maximus had served the imperial household for nearly 2 decades, first under Tiberius's predecessor and now under him. His loyalty was unquestionable, born not of love, but of professional duty, a quality Tiberius had come to value above all others. What is it, Maximus? The morning report, Caesar, and there are several matters requiring your attention. Maximus approached carefully, as all the palace staff had learned to do. Not from fear of violence. Tiberius was not a cruel ruler, but from an understanding of the emperor's preference for measured, respectful distance. Tiberius turned from the window and settled behind his desk, a massive piece of carved mahogany that had been a gift from the merchants of Alexandria. The surface was covered with scrolls, maps, and tablets, the endless paperwork of empire. Reports from governors in distant provinces, requests for troops and supplies, diplomatic correspondence from client kings and allied states, tax assessments, judicial appeals. The machinery of Roman power never rested. The grain shipments from Egypt are ahead of schedule, Maximus began, consulting his notes. The harbour masters report no delays, and the warehouses are well stocked for the coming season. However, there's been another riot in Antioch over tax assessments. Tiberius nodded, making notes on a wax tablet. These small disturbances were like sparks that could ignite into conflagrations if not properly managed. Send word to Governor Quintus. Tell him to reduce the assessment by 10% but double the patrols. Sometimes a small concession prevents a large rebellion. Yes, Caesar. Also, the Senate has requested an audience for this afternoon. Senator Cassius wishes to discuss the proposed public works project for the new aqueduct. At the mention of Senator Cassius, Tiberius's jaw tightened slightly. Gaius Cassius Longinus was one of the most ambitious men in the Senate, a descendant of the Cassius who had helped assassinate Julius Caesar a century before. Like his ancestor, this Cassius harbored Republican sympathies and barely concealed his resentment of imperial rule. Their meetings were always exercises in careful diplomacy, each man probing for weakness while maintaining the facade of cooperation. Schedule it for the 6th hour. And Maximus, ensure that Commander Brutus is present. The senator tends to be more reasonable when reminded of the Praetorian Guard's loyalty to the throne. Of course, Caesar. Maximus made another note. There's also the matter of the imperial physician. Quintus Flavius has requested an audience. He wishes to discuss your ongoing treatment. Tiberius touched his scarred cheek unconsciously. The old wound still ached sometimes, particularly when the weather changed or when he was under stress. More troubling were the headaches that had begun plaguing him in recent months, sharp, stabbing pains behind his left eye that the court physicians seemed unable to cure, despite their various remedies and consultations. What does he recommend now? More of his foul-tasting concoctions. Leeches, perhaps. There was a note of bitter humor in the emperor's voice. Actually, Caesar, he's suggesting a consultation with someone from outside the palace, a healer with a different approach to medicine, someone who has had success treating similar conditions. This was unusual enough to catch Tiberius's attention. The court physicians were jealous of their positions and rarely recommended outsiders. Who is this healer? Maximus consulted his scrolls again. A woman named Cassia Lucilla, a widow who practices in the Subura district. She's apparently developed quite a reputation for treating ailments that have proved difficult for conventional medicine. Flavius heard of her from a colleague whose wife she successfully treated for similar symptoms. The emperor considered this. The Subura was one of Rome's most crowded and poor districts, home to laborers, freedmen, and immigrants. It was not the sort of place where one would typically find someone worthy of imperial attention, but then again, sometimes wisdom came from unexpected quarters. What do we know of her background? She's the widow of a legionnaire who died in the German campaigns. She has no children, makes her living as a healer. By all accounts, she's highly skilled and completely trustworthy. No political connections, no family ambitions. Her only concern seems to be her practice. This last detail was what decided Tiberius. A woman with no political agenda, no family seeking advancement, no reason to wish him ill or to gain from treating him beyond her fee. In a city where everyone wanted something from the emperor, such a person was as rare as honest gold. Very well. Arrange for her to come to the palace. But discreetly, I don't want half of Rome knowing the emperor needs to consult a healer from the slums. And Maximus, yes, Caesar, have her thoroughly investigated first. I may be willing to trust her medical skills, but I'm not yet ready to trust her with my life without knowing who she truly is. As Maximus departed to carry out his orders, Tiberius returned to his scrolls, but his mind wandered. The irony was not lost on him, he who commanded the loyalty of 30 legions, who could have any woman in the empire brought to his bed with a word, who owned palaces and villas from Britain to Egypt. He could not find a single soul willing to look past his scarred face and see the man beneath. The noble families of Rome had daughters aplenty, but none would risk their bloodlines on an alliance with a ruler marked by violence and betrayal. They offered their congratulations on his victories, their counsel in times of decision, their support in the Senate, but never their daughters. Not to a man whose face told the story of brother killing brother. He had tried, in the early years of his reign, to find a suitable match. There had been diplomatic overtures, carefully worded suggestions, lavish entertainments where eligible young women were paraded before him like prize horses at auction. But always he saw the same thing in their eyes, fascination mixed with revulsion, curiosity tempered by fear. They looked at him as they might look at a gladiator in the arena, impressive in his power and ferocity, but not something one would willingly take home. The afternoon passed in the familiar routine of imperial business. The meeting with Senator Cassius proved as tedious as expected, the man using an hour to say what could have been communicated in 10 minutes, all while subtly probing for signs of weakness or opportunity. Commander Brutus's presence did indeed keep the senator's tongue somewhat in check. But Tiberius could see the calculating gleam in the man's eyes as he spoke of the glory of the Republic and the burden of solitary rule. After dismissing the senator, Tiberius took his evening meal alone in his private dining room, a habit that had become as fixed as the rising of the sun. The room was magnificent, walls painted with scenes of Roman victories, floors inlaid with precious stones from across the empire, furniture that represented the finest craftsmanship of a dozen provinces. Yet for all its grandeur, it felt hollow when occupied by only one man. As the sun set over the 7 hills of Rome, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Tiberius found himself once again at his window, looking out over his domain. Somewhere in the crowded streets below, the healer named Cassia was going about her evening routine, unaware that her life was about to intersect with that of the most powerful man in the world. Tomorrow she would come to the palace and perhaps, just perhaps, she would see what no one else had been able to see for 7 long years. The Emperor of Rome allowed himself a moment of hope, fragile as a butterfly's wing, that maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time someone would look upon him and see not the scar, not the whispered stories of fratricide, not the terrible loneliness of absolute power, but simply a man in need of healing. The summons came at dawn, delivered by a Praetorian guard whose polished armor caught the first rays of sunlight filtering through the narrow window of Cassia's modest dwelling. She had been grinding herbs in her wooden mortar, preparing the day's remedies, when the sharp rap on her door interrupted the peaceful rhythm of her morning routine. "Cassia Lucilla." The guard's voice was formal, respectful but firm. "I am she." Cassia set down her mortar and wiped her hands on her apron, studying the young soldier with calm brown eyes. In her 43 years, she had learned to read people quickly, a skill essential for a healer who treated everyone from desperate mothers to hardened criminals in the Subura. This guard was nervous, though he tried to hide it behind military bearing. "You are commanded to attend the imperial palace at the 3rd hour. A litter will be provided for your transport." Cassia's heart skipped, but her face remained serene. A summons to the palace could mean many things, few of them good for someone of her station. "May I ask the nature of this?" "Command? You are to provide medical consultation to Caesar himself. Bring whatever healing supplies you deem necessary." After the guard departed, Cassia stood in her small room, trying to process what had just occurred. The emperor, the scarred emperor whose story was whispered in every tavern and marketplace in Rome, had summoned her. She had heard the tales, of course. Everyone had. The brother's betrayal, the terrible wound that marked his face, the loneliness that surrounded him like a wall of thorns. Moving with practiced efficiency, she gathered her supplies into a worn leather satchel that had belonged to her late husband, Marcus. Inside went her collection of healing herbs, small vials of oils and tinctures, needles for acupuncture, and clean linen for bandages. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked, not from fear, but from a strange anticipation she couldn't quite name. The imperial litter arrived precisely at the appointed hour, carried by 8 burly slaves and accompanied by a small escort of guards. As they made their way through the streets of Rome, Cassia watched the city transform around her. The cramped, shadowy buildings of the Subura gave way to broader avenues, lined with statues and fountains. The people changed too, from laborers and shopkeepers to well-dressed citizens and slaves in fine livery. The palace itself rose before them like a mountain of marble and gold, its columns reaching toward the heavens, its walls adorned with the spoils of a dozen conquered nations. Cassia had never seen anything so magnificent, yet something about its grandeur felt cold, imposing rather than welcoming. Inside, she was led through corridors that seemed to stretch for miles, past rooms filled with treasures that could feed entire districts, past guards who stood like statues at every doorway. Finally, they reached a smaller chamber where she was told to wait. The room was elegant, but more intimate than the grand hall she had passed through. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating frescoes that depicted peaceful scenes of Roman countryside. Farmers tending their fields, children playing beside streams, families gathering for harvest festivals. It was, she realized, a room designed to soothe rather than intimidate. The healer Cassia Lucilam. She turned at the sound of her name being announced, and her breath caught in her throat. Emperor Tiberius Lucianus stood in the doorway, and her first thought was how the stories had failed to capture the full measure of the man. Yes, the scar was there, an angry red line that ran from temple to jaw, impossible to ignore. But what struck her more powerfully was his bearing. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the bearing of a soldier despite his imperial purple. His hair, dark brown shot through with silver, was cut in the practical style of a military man, rather than the elaborate coiffures favored by many nobles. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, held intelligence and wariness in equal measure, yet beneath the emperor's impressive presence, Cassia's healer's instincts detected something else. Pain, not just physical, though she could see the subtle tension around his eyes that spoke of chronic discomfort, but something deeper. A bone-deep weariness that went far beyond mere fatigue. Caesar. She inclined her head respectfully, neither too low nor too high. A lifetime of treating people from all walks of life had taught her the art of showing proper respect without groveling. You may rise. I'm told you have success treating conditions that have baffled the court physicians. His voice was rich and deep, carrying the authority of absolute command. Yet she detected an underlying note of skepticism. This was a man who had been disappointed before, who had learned not to hope too readily. I make no grand claims, Caesar. I simply use methods passed down through generations of healers, combined with what I have learned through years of practice. Each person is different, each ailment unique. Tiberius studied her carefully. She was not what he had expected. The court physicians were all elderly men, with flowing beards and pompous manners, full of theories about humors and celestial influences. This woman appeared to be in her early 40s, with silver threads beginning to show in her dark brown hair, which she wore in a simple braid. Her clothing was clean but modest, the practical garments of a working healer, rather than the elaborate robes favored by court physicians. But it was her eyes that truly caught his attention. They were warm brown like polished wood, and when she looked at him, he saw something remarkable. She looked at his whole face, not just the scar. There was no flinching, no careful avoidance of his left side, no mixture of fascination and revulsion that he had grown so accustomed to seeing. Tell me about your symptoms, Caesar. Her voice was gentle but professional, the tone of someone accustomed to putting patients at ease. Tiberius found himself responding despite his usual wariness. Headaches, sharp pains behind my left eye, particularly when I am under stress or when the weather changes. They have grown worse in recent months. The court physicians have tried various remedies, bloodletting, purges, special diets, but nothing provides lasting relief. Cassia nodded, her expression thoughtful. May I examine the area around your injury? I will need to touch your face to properly assess the condition. The Emperor hesitated. It had been years since anyone had touched his scarred cheek willingly, except for the court physician's clinical proddings. But something in her manner, calm, professional, completely free of revulsion, made him nod his consent. Please, sit here where the light is better. She guided him to a chair near the window, then stood beside him. Her touch, when it came, was gentle but sure. Her fingertips traced the edges of the scar, not with morbid curiosity, but with the focused attention of a craftsman examining her work. She pressed lightly at various points along his temple and jaw, watching his face for reactions. The weapon that caused this, was it a blade? A dagger! My brother's dagger! The words came out more bitter than he had intended, and he saw her pause in her examination. I'm sorry. That must have been very difficult. It was such a simple statement, but something in her tone, not pity, not political calculation, just genuine human sympathy, caught him off guard. When had anyone last offered him uncomplicated compassion? The physical wound healed well, she continued, returning to her examination. Your surgeon was skilled, but I suspect the blade may have damaged some of the smaller nerves beneath the skin. Over time, scar tissue can create pressure points that cause exactly the kind of pain you describe. She moved to face him directly, her hands gentle on either side of his head as she felt along his temples and the base of his skull. This close, he could smell the faint scent of herbs that clung to her, lavender, rosemary, and something else he couldn't identify. It was clean and comforting, like a garden after rain. I believe I can help with your pain, Caesar, but the treatment will require multiple sessions over several weeks. Are you willing to commit to such a course? Tiberius looked into her steady brown eyes and felt something he hadn't experienced in years, trust beginning to bloom. Not the careful, calculated trust he extended to his advisors and generals, but something simpler and more fundamental. Here was a person who seemed to want nothing from him except to heal his pain. Yes, he said quietly, I am willing, as she began to pack her supplies back into her satchel, explaining the treatment she proposed, and when she would return. Tiberius felt a strange lightness in his chest. For the first time in 7 years, someone had looked upon him not as the scarred emperor, not as a cautionary tale of ambition and betrayal, but simply as a patient in need of healing. He did not yet recognize the feeling for what it was, the first stirring of hope that perhaps he might find more than just relief from pain in this unexpected encounter. But somewhere deep in his guarded heart, a door that had been locked for years was beginning to creak open. 3 days later, Cassia returned to the palace carrying a small wooden box that had belonged to her grandmother, a collection of silver needles so fine they seemed to catch light like spider's silk. The Praetorian guards had grown familiar with her presence, nodding respectfully as she passed through the corridors that no longer seemed quite so intimidating. She found the emperor in the same chamber as before, standing at the window with his hands clasped behind his back. The morning light revealed details she hadn't noticed during their first meeting. The careful way he held his left shoulder slightly higher than his right, as if protecting that side of his face from view, and the faint lines of chronic pain etched around his eyes. Caesar, she set her box on the small table and began arranging her instruments with the methodical precision of long practice. Cassia, he turned from the window, and she caught something different in his expression, not quite eagerness, but a cautious hope that hadn't been there before. I confess, I've been curious about your methods. The court physicians seem to believe that most ailments stem from an imbalance of humors. Perhaps they do, in some cases. She selected one of the silver needles, testing its sharpness against her fingertip. But I have found that pain often has simpler causes. Muscles that have tightened to protect an injury, nerves that have been compressed by scar tissue, blood that no longer flows freely through damaged vessels. Sometimes healing requires not grand theories, but small corrections. As she spoke, she guided him to the chair again. This time he settled more easily, the wariness in his posture marginally relaxed. Trust, she knew, was built in small increments, like constructing a bridge one stone at a time. "This may feel strange at first," she warned, positioning the first needle near his temple. "But it should not be painful." The needle slipped beneath his skin like a whisper, and she watched his face carefully for any sign of discomfort. Instead, she saw surprise. "I feel warmth spreading from the point where you place the needle." "Good. That means your body is responding as it should." She placed 2 more needles along the line of his scar, each one carefully positioned to release the tension she had felt in the underlying tissue. This technique comes from the East, from healers in Silk Road cities where Roman and Chinese knowledge meet. The needles help restore the natural flow of energy through the body. As she worked, a comfortable silence settled between them. Tiberius found himself studying her profile as she concentrated on her task. There was something deeply peaceful about her movements, economical and sure, like watching a master craftsman at work. Her hands were those of a healer, gentle but strong, with small scars on her fingertips from years of handling herbs and instruments. "Tell me about your husband," he said suddenly, surprising himself with the question. He rarely inquired about the personal lives of those who served him. Cassia's hands paused for just a moment before continuing their work. "Marcus was a good man, a centurion in the 10th Legion. He served in Germania under General Varro." Her voice was soft with memory. "He used to say that the worst part of being a soldier wasn't the fighting, but the waiting. The long nights in camp, wondering if you would see home again. I knew Varro, a competent commander. Your husband must have been an exceptional soldier to rise to centurion rank." "He was. But more than that, he was kind. He could calm a frightened horse or settle a dispute between his men with equal skill. When he died, a fever took him in the winter camps. His fellow soldiers brought his personal effects back to me. They told me stories about how he had helped them, protected them, taught the younger ones how to survive their first battles." She placed another needle, this one at the base of his skull. "I think that's why I became a healer. Marcus always said that the greatest victory was bringing everyone home alive. I suppose I'm trying to continue that work in my own way." Tiberius was quiet for a long moment, processing this glimpse into her life. Her grief was old but not forgotten, woven into the fabric of who she had become, rather than defining her entirely. It was, he realized, a healthier way of carrying loss than his own bitter isolation. "You never remarried." "No, Marcus and I were not blessed with children, and after he died, I found my purpose in my work. There have been opportunities, but no one who felt like the right match." She smiled slightly. "Besides, most men are intimidated by a woman who can set bones and brew remedies that could either cure them or kill them." Despite himself, Tiberius found himself almost smiling at that. "I imagine that would be somewhat unnerving during domestic disagreements." "Exactly." This time her smile was fuller, and he saw how it transformed her face, bringing out the warmth in her brown eyes. "Though I've never actually poisoned anyone, despite what some of my more difficult patients might claim." The easy humor in her voice was something entirely new in his experience. The courtiers and senators who surrounded him were always careful in their speech, every word measured for political advantage or potential offense. This woman spoke to him as if he was simply another person, not the embodiment of imperial power. "The needles can remain in place for about a quarter hour," she said, stepping back to observe her work. "How does the pain feel now?" Tiberius considered. The sharp, stabbing sensation behind his left eye had indeed diminished, replaced by the warm, spreading sensation she had mentioned. "Better, significantly better. How is this possible?" "The body has its own wisdom about healing, if we give it the right encouragement. The needles help release the tension that builds up around old injuries. Your muscles have been protecting that area for years, staying tight and rigid to prevent further damage. But that protection comes at a cost. Reduced blood flow, compressed nerves, constant strain." She moved to the window while they waited, looking out at the gardens beyond. "Your palace is beautiful, Caesar. I've never seen gardens so perfectly maintained. They were my predecessor's passion. I have maintained them because they provide a sense of peace in a place that is often lacking in such things." He paused, then added quietly, "Sometimes I walk among them in the early morning, before the day's business begins. It's the only time I feel truly alone with my thoughts." Cassia turned to look at him, noting the wistful quality in his voice. Here was a man who commanded the loyalty of millions, but had no one with whom he could simply exist without the weight of expectation and responsibility. "Solitude can be healing," she said gently, "but too much of it can become its own kind of prison." Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment the careful barriers between emperor and subject seemed to thin. In that shared look was an understanding that neither of them fully recognized yet, the recognition of two souls who had both known loss and learned to carry their burdens alone. When she removed the needles, a short time later, Tiberius felt better than he had in months. The constant low-level ache that had become his normal state was gone, replaced by a sense of clarity and lightness he had almost forgotten was possible. "I would like to continue these treatments," he said as she packed her instruments away. "How often would you recommend?" "Every 3 days initially. As your condition improves, we can space them further apart." She hesitated, then added, "Caesar, if I may, you carry a great deal of tension in your shoulders and neck as well. It's contributing to your headaches. Perhaps we might work on that as well." "Yes, whatever you think best." As she prepared to leave, Tiberius found himself reluctant to see her go. Their sessions were becoming the brightest points in his carefully ordered but increasingly empty days. A week passed, and the sessions had settled into a rhythm that both emperor and healer found surprisingly comfortable. Cassia arrived each time carrying not just her medical supplies, but small offerings that spoke to a growing familiarity: a sprig of mint from her garden, honey cakes from a baker in the Subura whose recipes she particularly admired, or pressed flowers that carried the scent of Rome's humbler neighborhoods. On this particular morning, she found Tiberius not at his usual place by the window, but seated at his desk, frowning over a letter that bore the distinctive seal of the eastern provinces. "Troubling news, Caesar." He looked up, and she noticed how quickly his expression shifted from the harsh lines of imperial concern to something softer when he saw her. "Nothing that cannot be managed. The governor of Syria has died unexpectedly, and there are 3 different men claiming to be his rightful successor. Each has the backing of different factions in the province." Cassia set down her leather satchel and began arranging her instruments, but she sensed the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge. "Such decisions must weigh heavily on you. Choose wrongly, and thousands of people suffer the consequences." "Exactly." Tiberius rose from his desk, rolling his shoulders in a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of mounting stress. "The eastern provinces are always delicate. Too much direct control, and they rebel against Roman authority. Too little, and they fragment into warring factions. Finding the right balance requires understanding not just law and politics, but the character of the men involved." She guided him to the chair, noting how the lines around his eyes had deepened since their last session. "Have you met any of these claimants personally?" "2 of them. Marcus Antonius Flavius served as my legate during the Pannonian campaign. Competent but ambitious. He sees this appointment as a stepping stone to higher office." Tiberius settled into the chair, unconsciously tilting his head to give her better access to his scarred temple. "Gaius Domitius Crassus is the son of a senator and has never been east of Brundisium, but his family connections make him the favorite of certain factions in Rome." The first needle went in with practiced ease, and she saw some of the tension leave his shoulders immediately. "And the third?" "Lucius Junius Maximus, a career administrator who has spent 15 years in various eastern posts. He knows the provinces, speaks the local languages, understands the tribal dynamics, but he lacks the noble bloodline that makes men respect imperial appointments." Cassia placed 2 more needles along the line of his jaw, noting how the scar tissue had begun to soften under her treatments. "If you were advising someone else, which would you recommend?" Tiberius was quiet for a moment, considering. It was unusual for him to discuss matters of state with anyone outside his inner circle of advisors, yet he found Cassia's perspective oddly valuable. She had no political agenda, no family interests to advance, and her experience treating people from all walks of life had given her insights into human nature that court-bred advisors often lacked. Maximus is the best choice for the provinces and their people. But appointing him will anger the senatorial class and could create difficulties here in Rome. She moved to work on the tension points at the base of his neck. The eternal challenge of leadership, balancing what is right with what is possible. You speak as if you understand such burdens. Cassia's hands paused briefly in their work. In my own small way, perhaps I do. When I treat patients in the Subura, I often face similar choices. There are remedies that would help people, but cost more than they can afford. There are treatments that could cure ailments, but require ingredients that are impossible to obtain. Sometimes I must choose between helping one person completely and helping several people partially. She resumed her work, her touch gentle but firm as she worked to release the knots of tension in his shoulders. My husband used to say that leadership was about making the best decision you could with the information you had, then living with the consequences without regret. Wise advice. Though easier said than practiced, they fell into companionable silence as she continued the treatment. Through the tall windows, the sounds of Rome drifted up from the streets below. Merchants calling their wares, the clatter of cartwheels on stone, the distant sound of children playing. For Tiberius, these ordinary sounds had become a kind of music, a reminder that beyond the marble walls of the palace, life continued in all its messy, vital complexity. Cassia, he said suddenly, surprising them both with the informality of using her name without title or ceremony. May I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you ever regret not having children? The question hung in the air between them, more intimate than any they had shared before. Cassia's hands stilled for a moment, then resumed their careful work. Sometimes, she admitted. Marcus and I tried for years. We saw physicians, made offerings at temples, consulted oracles. Nothing helped. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the old grief beneath it. After he died, I threw myself into my work, partly to avoid thinking about it. But as the years passed, I came to see that there are different ways to nurture life. Every person I heal, every pain I ease, perhaps that is its own form of legacy. Tiberius found himself thinking about his own lack of heirs, a subject that caused him increasing anxiety as the years passed. The Senate would expect him to name a successor eventually, but the prospect of choosing someone to inherit the terrible burden of absolute power seemed almost cruel. I have no children either, he said quietly. No family left at all after... He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. After your brother's betrayal. She completed the thought gently. That must be a very lonely way to live. It is. The admission came out more raw than he had intended. Sometimes I think the gods cursed me to live surrounded by people, but truly known by none of them. Cassia's hands moved to his temples, her touch so gentle it felt like a blessing. Perhaps the gods have simply been preparing you for something different. Perhaps isolation was never meant to be your permanent state. When she removed the needles a short time later, Tiberius felt more than just physical relief. Their conversation had touched something in him that had been dormant for years. The simple human need to be understood, to have someone see beyond the imperial purple to the man beneath. Will you stay a little longer today? He asked as she began packing her instruments. I find myself curious about your other patients. What kinds of ailments do you treat in the Subura? A smile played at the corners of her mouth. Everything imaginable. Broken bones, difficult births, fevers, wounds from tavern fights, children with coughs that won't go away. Last week I treated a gladiator with a dislocated shoulder and a senator's wife with sleeplessness. A senator's wife comes to you. Word spreads quickly when someone finds relief from pain, regardless of their station. Pain is one of the few things that makes all people equal. As she settled into the chair across from him and began to describe her work, Tiberius found himself genuinely engaged in a conversation that had nothing to do with politics, military strategy, or affairs of state. For the first time in years, he was simply a man listening to a woman talk about her life, and the ordinary magic of that simple human connection was more healing than any medicine. 2 weeks into their regular sessions, Tiberius made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of receiving Cassia in the formal chamber they had been using, he asked Maximus to arrange for her to meet him in his private gardens, a space he had never shared with anyone except the most trusted members of his household. The gardens were his sanctuary, a place where he could walk among olive trees and flowering vines without the weight of imperial ceremony. Here, gravel paths wound between beds of lavender and rosemary, and a small fountain provided the gentle sound of running water that helped quiet his restless thoughts. When Cassia arrived, carried as usual in the imperial litter but this time deposited at a side entrance near the gardens, she paused in wonder. After the grand marble halls of the palace proper, this space felt almost intimate, designed for contemplation rather than display. She found Tiberius seated on a simple stone bench beneath an ancient fig tree, still dressed in his imperial toga, but looking somehow more human in this natural setting. The morning light filtered through the leaves, casting gentle shadows across his face and softening the harsh line of his scar. "This is beautiful," she said, settling her leather satchel on the ground and taking in the careful arrangement of plants and pathways. "It feels like a place where the soul could truly rest." That was the intention. "My predecessor believed that a ruler needed a place apart from the business of empire, somewhere to remember that he was mortal." Tiberius gestured to the bench beside him. "I thought perhaps we could conduct today's session here. The fresh air might be beneficial." As she began her preparations, Cassia noticed subtle changes in him that spoke to the effectiveness of their treatments. The constant tension in his shoulders had eased, and the deep lines around his eyes had softened. More significantly, there was something different in his bearing, less guarded, more present in the moment. "Your headaches have improved markedly," she observed, as she positioned the first needle. "How do you feel otherwise?" "Better than I have in years," he admitted. "Not just physically. There's a clarity of thought that I hadn't realized I was missing. Even the business of ruling seems less burdensome somehow." She placed several more needles along his neck and shoulders, working to address the chronic tension that years of stress had carved into his muscles. "Pain has a way of coloring everything. When it lifts, the world often seems brighter, more manageable." As they settled into the familiar rhythm of treatment, a small bird landed on the edge of the fountain, dipping its beak to drink. They both watched in comfortable silence, and Tiberius found himself remembering a time when such simple pleasures had been part of his daily existence before the weight of empire had made him forget how to notice the small gifts that life offered. "Cassia," he said suddenly, "what do you do when you're not healing people? How do you spend your leisure time?" She smiled at the question. "I tend a small garden behind my dwelling. Nothing as grand as this, but it provides herbs for my practice and vegetables for my table. I read when I can find books worth reading, stories mostly, though I have a particular fondness for the old Greek philosophers. And I visit the baths once a week to catch up on neighborhood gossip." The casual normalcy of her life struck him as almost exotic. When had he last done something simply because it brought him pleasure? When had he last had a conversation that wasn't about policy or strategy or the endless complications of governing an empire? "Tell me about your garden," he said, genuinely curious. As she described her small plot of land, the rosemary bush that had belonged to her grandmother, the mint that grew wild and needed constant pruning, the tomatoes that produced fruit sweeter than any served at imperial banquets, Tiberius found himself enchanted by her obvious affection for these humble plants. "You speak of them as if they were friends," he observed. "In a way, they are. Each plant has its own personality, its own needs and gifts. The lavender is sturdy and reliable, always producing exactly what you expect. The thyme is delicate but resilient. It can survive drought and neglect, but rewards careful attention with extraordinary fragrance. She paused in her work to adjust one of the needles. Plants are honest in a way that people often are not. They show you exactly what they need, and they respond predictably to care. Tiberius considered this. Unlike governing, where the best intentions can produce entirely unexpected consequences. Exactly. Though I suppose there are similarities too. Both require patience, attention to small details, and the wisdom to know when to act and when to wait. A comfortable silence fell between them as she continued the treatment. In the distance, they could hear the faint sounds of the palace staff going about their daily business. But here in the garden, those sounds seemed to belong to another world entirely. "I've been thinking about our conversation regarding the Syrian appointment," Tiberius said eventually. "I've decided to recommend Maximus for the position." Cassia's hands paused briefly in their work. "That will be difficult politically." "Yes, but you were right. Sometimes leadership requires choosing what is right over what is easy. The eastern provinces have suffered enough from administrators who see their appointments as personal opportunities rather than public trusts. Your advisors will not be pleased. No doubt. Senator Cassius in particular will see this as another example of my failure to appreciate the traditional prerogatives of the senatorial class." Tiberius's tone held a note of weary amusement. "But the senators are not the ones who must live with the consequences of poor governance in distant provinces." She resumed her work, noting the renewed tension that had crept into his shoulders at the mention of political opposition. "Does it help to remember that you cannot please everyone? That trying to do so often means pleasing no one." "Sometimes, though there are moments when the isolation of command feels particularly heavy. Every decision I make affects thousands of lives, yet I must make most of them alone, based on incomplete information and the counsel of people who may have their own agendas." The raw honesty in his voice touched something deep in Cassia's heart. Here was a man who bore burdens that would crush most people, yet he carried them with a dignity that spoke to strength of character rather than mere duty. "Perhaps," she said gently, "the gods do not expect perfection from mortals, even mortal rulers. Perhaps they ask only that we do our best with wisdom and compassion, and trust that honest effort will find its own reward." When she finished the treatment and began packing her instruments, Tiberius found himself reluctant to return to the demanding routine of imperial business. These stolen hours in the garden, with their combination of healing touch and genuine conversation, had become an oasis of peace in his carefully structured but emotionally barren existence. "Will you come again in 3 days?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Of course. Your treatment is progressing well, but consistency is important for lasting results." As she prepared to leave, Tiberius made another impulsive decision. "Cassia, would you be willing to stay a little longer? Perhaps you could tell me more about those Greek philosophers you mentioned. It has been too long since I engaged with ideas that have nothing to do with governing." The request was unprecedented, an emperor asking a commoner to extend a social visit, but something in his tone, vulnerable beneath its imperial authority, made it impossible to refuse. As she settled back onto the bench and began to speak of Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, neither of them fully recognized what was happening between them. But in that sun-dappled garden, surrounded by the timeless rhythms of growing things, something was taking root that would prove more transformative than either political alliance or military conquest. The whispers began in the palace corridors, like smoke seeping through cracks in marble. Servants noticed that the emperor's disposition had improved markedly in recent weeks. Guards observed that he walked with less tension in his shoulders, that the sharp edge of irritation that had characterized his interactions for years had softened. Most significantly, members of his inner circle noticed that his decisions seemed more measured, more thoughtful, as if some burden had been lifted from his mind. Senator Cassius was among the first to connect these changes to the regular visits of the healer from the Subura. During a meeting of the Senate's inner council, he raised the matter with characteristic subtlety. "Caesar seems quite restored to health lately," he observed, his tone carefully neutral. "Perhaps we should express our gratitude to whatever physician has achieved such remarkable results." The comment hung in the air like a fishing line cast into still water, and Cassius watched carefully to see what it might catch. Several other senators exchanged glances. They too had noticed the emperor's improved demeanor and wondered about its cause. "I understand he has been consulting with someone outside the usual court." "Physicians," added Senator Marcus Brutus, a descendant of the more famous Brutus, and a man who shared his ancestors' talent for reading political currents. "Some woman from the common districts. How unconventional," Cassius murmured, filing this information away for future consideration. An emperor who formed attachments to people outside the traditional power structure was either refreshingly unpredictable or dangerously unpredictable, depending on one's perspective. Meanwhile, in his private study, Tiberius found himself looking forward to Cassia's visits with an anticipation that went far beyond mere medical relief. Their conversations had evolved from the professional exchanges of physician and patient to something approaching genuine friendship, a connection he had not experienced since before his brother's betrayal. On this particular afternoon, as autumn painted the garden leaves in shades of gold and crimson, he waited for her with an unusual sense of nervousness. Over the past week, he had found himself thinking about her not just during their sessions, but at odd moments throughout his days. The memory of her laugh when he had made an unexpectedly dry observation about bureaucratic inefficiency. The way she tilted her head when considering a particularly complex point in their philosophical discussions. The gentle competence of her hands as she worked to ease his chronic pain. When she arrived, carrying a small basket in addition to her usual leather satchel, he felt the familiar lift in his spirits that her presence invariably brought. "I brought you something," she said, settling beside him on their usual bench beneath the fig tree. From the basket, she withdrew a small clay pot containing a cutting from her garden. "Rosemary from my grandmother's original plant. I thought perhaps it might thrive here in your garden." The gift was simple, inexpensive, yet it touched him more deeply than the costly presents he regularly received from provincial governors and client kings. This represented something personal, a piece of her own life offered freely without expectation of political advantage. "Thank you," he said, accepting the pot with unusual care. "I will have the head gardener plant it in a place of honor." As she began his treatment, working with the familiar rhythm they had developed over weeks of practice, Tiberius found himself studying her profile with new attention. When had he begun to notice the way the afternoon light brought out the gold highlights in her brown hair? When had her presence become not just welcome, but necessary for his peace of mind? "You seem thoughtful today," she observed, placing a needle near his temple with practiced precision. "Is there something troubling you?" He hesitated, unsure how to articulate the confusion of feelings that had been growing within him. How could he explain that his greatest fear was no longer political opposition or military threats, but the possibility that these sessions might end? That the prospect of returning to his former isolation filled him with a dread deeper than any he had felt on ancient battlefields? "Now, Cassia," he said finally, "what would you say if I told you that our meetings have become far more important to me than mere medical treatment?" Her hands stilled for a moment, and he saw something flicker across her expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition of something she had been feeling herself but had not dared to acknowledge. "I would say," she replied carefully, "that healing often encompasses more than physical ailments. Sometimes the cure for one form of suffering reveals other needs that we hadn't recognized." They looked at each other in the golden afternoon light, and something passed between them that neither had quite expected, an acknowledgement of attraction that went beyond the careful boundaries they had established. She was the first to look away, but not before he saw the answering awareness in her brown eyes. "We should be careful," she said quietly, resuming her work, but with slightly less steady hands. There are people who watch your every move, who look for anything they might use to their advantage. An emperor's friendships are never simple matters. No, he agreed, though the word came out more regretfully than he had intended. They are not. But even as they spoke of caution, both of them were acutely aware of the charged atmosphere that had settled over them. When she adjusted the position of a needle, her fingertips brushed against his skin with a gentleness that had nothing to do with medical necessity. When he spoke, his voice carried a warmth that made even mundane observations sound like intimate confidences. "Tell me about your week," he said, seeking safer ground. "How are your other patients?" She launched into an account of her recent cases: a baker's wife with persistent stomach pains, a child with a fever that had finally broken after 3 days of careful nursing, an elderly man whose arthritis was responding well to the herbal treatment she had prepared. As she spoke, Tiberius found himself envying these people their access to her care, their ability to seek her help without the complicated calculations that surrounded every aspect of his own life. "You speak of them with such affection," he observed. "Do you ever become too attached to your patients?" The question carried implications that neither of them was quite ready to address directly, but Cassia felt its weight nonetheless. "Sometimes," she admitted, "especially when someone has been suffering for a long time and you begin to see improvement. There's a satisfaction in watching pain diminish, in seeing someone rediscover hope they thought they had lost forever." She paused, then added more quietly, "But attachment can complicate judgment. A healer must always maintain some emotional distance for the good of both patient and physician. And what if that distance becomes difficult to maintain?" Their eyes met again, and this time neither looked away immediately. In that shared gaze was the recognition of a connection that had grown beyond professional boundaries, beyond the careful protocols that governed interactions between emperor and subject. "Then," she said softly, "one must decide whether the risk is worth the potential reward, and whether both parties are prepared to accept the consequences of such a choice." As the session continued, both Tiberius and Cassia were acutely aware that they stood at a crossroads. The easy friendship they had developed was transforming into something deeper, more complex, and infinitely more dangerous for both of them. The revelation came on a rain-soaked evening in late autumn, delivered by Maximus with the kind of grim efficiency that characterized all news of political significance in imperial Rome. Tiberius had been reviewing grain distribution reports when his secretary entered the study with an expression that immediately commanded attention. "Caesar, there is a matter of some urgency that requires your immediate consideration." Tiberius set aside his scrolls, noting the unusual tension in Maximus's voice. In 20 years of service, the man had developed an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under pressure. Whatever news he carried was significant indeed. "Speak plainly, Maximus. What has happened?" "We have intercepted correspondence between Senator Cassius and several provincial governors. The letters suggest the formation of what can only be described as a conspiracy against your rule." Maximus placed a leather portfolio on the desk. "The evidence is contained within these documents." Tiberius felt a familiar cold weight settle in his stomach, the same sensation he had experienced 7 years earlier when first reports reached him of his brother's treachery. He opened the portfolio and began reading, his expression growing darker with each line. The conspiracy was more extensive than anything he had imagined. Cassius had been systematically cultivating support among provincial governors, promising them greater autonomy in exchange for their backing in what he termed a return to traditional Republican values. More troubling still were the detailed plans for Tiberius's assassination, scheduled to take place during the upcoming festival of Saturnalia, when security protocols would be relaxed for the public celebrations. "How did we obtain these documents?" Tiberius asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. One of the conspirators lost his nerve and approached Commander Brutus. Apparently, the thought of regicide proved more disturbing in reality than in theory. Maximus paused, then added carefully, "Caesar, there is another matter related to this conspiracy that you must know about." Something in his tone made Tiberius look up sharply. "Continue. The conspirators have been investigating everyone in your inner circle, looking for potential weaknesses they might exploit. This includes the healer, Cassia Lucilla." Tiberius felt his blood turn to ice. "What have they discovered?" Maximus consulted another scroll with obvious reluctance. "They know about her regular visits to the palace. They know about the improvement in your health and disposition. And they have developed a theory about the nature of your relationship with her." "What kind of theory?" "They believe she has been sent to seduce you, to make you vulnerable through emotional attachment. Cassius has been spreading whispers that she is a spy, possibly in the service of Eastern kingdoms that oppose Roman rule in their territories." The accusation hit Tiberius like a physical blow. After months of genuine connection, of trust carefully built and freely given, the possibility that it had all been an elaborate deception was almost unbearable to contemplate. Yet he had learned from bitter experience that betrayal often came from the most unexpected quarters. Is there any evidence to support these claims? None whatsoever. Every investigation into her background confirms what we originally discovered. She is exactly what she appears to be, a widow making her living as a healer. But Caesar, you must understand that evidence is irrelevant to the conspirators' purposes. They need only convince enough people that the possibility exists. Tiberius stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the rain-swept courtyard while his mind raced through the implications. If the conspiracy succeeded in casting doubt on Cassia's loyalty, it would destroy not only their relationship, but potentially her life as well. The penalty for spying against the emperor was death, and even unfounded accusations could prove fatal in the charged atmosphere of political crisis. "What do you recommend?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Suspend her visits immediately. Distance yourself from any appearance of impropriety. The conspiracy depends partly on portraying you as compromised by emotional weakness. Removing that perception removes one of their strongest arguments against your fitness to rule." The practical wisdom of this advice was undeniable, yet the thought of cutting ties with Cassia felt like voluntarily amputating a part of himself that had only recently come back to life. More than that, it felt like a betrayal of the trust she had offered him so freely. And what of Cassia herself? If I simply cease her visits without explanation, she becomes vulnerable to retaliation from Cassius and his allies. They may seek to silence her permanently to prevent any future testimony about their accusations. Maximus nodded grimly. That risk exists. However, there are ways to ensure her protection without maintaining direct contact. We could arrange for her to be relocated to one of your estates outside Rome, ostensibly for her own safety, but actually to remove her from the political equation entirely. Tiberius turned from the window, his face set in the hard lines that his subordinates had learned to associate with difficult decisions. "Summon Commander Brutus." "I want every member of this conspiracy arrested tonight, quietly and simultaneously. If we move quickly enough, we can prevent them from destroying evidence or fleeing the city and the woman." For a long moment Tiberius was silent, wrestling with emotions that pulled him in opposite directions. The rational part of his mind recognized that protecting Cassia meant separating himself from her, at least until the immediate crisis had passed. But the part of him that had begun to hope again, that had dared to imagine a future less lonely than his past, rebelled against such cold calculation. "Send word that I require her services urgently tonight, but bring her through the private entrance and ensure that no one observes her arrival or departure. I will not have her destroyed by accusations she cannot defend against or understand." An hour later, Cassia arrived at the palace through a side entrance she had never used before, escorted by guards whose grim demeanor immediately told her that something was seriously wrong. Instead of being led to the emperor's study or their usual meeting place in the gardens, she was brought to a small, sparsely furnished chamber deep within the palace complex. Tiberius was waiting for her, but the man she found bore little resemblance to the increasingly relaxed and open person she had come to know over their weeks together. This was the emperor in full imperial mode, controlled, distant, wearing his authority like armor. Caesar? She set down her satchel, immediately sensing that this was not a normal medical consultation.
Has something happened?
Sit down, Cassia. There are things you must know, and decisions that must be made tonight. As he explained the conspiracy, the accusations against her, and the immediate danger they both faced, Cassia felt her world shifting beneath her feet like sand in an earthquake. The simple life she had built for herself, the quiet satisfaction of her healing practice, even her growing feelings for this complex and wounded man, all of it was suddenly under threat from forces she had never imagined. "They believe I am a spy?" she asked, incredulous. "What evidence could they possibly have for such a claim?" "They need no evidence beyond the fact that you have become important to me. In their minds, any woman who gains influence over an emperor must be serving some hidden agenda." His voice was bitter with old pain. "It is one of the curses of absolute power. Genuine affection becomes indistinguishable from manipulation." The full weight of their situation settled over her like a heavy cloak. She understood now why he had been so reluctant to trust, so careful to maintain emotional distance. In his world, even the simplest human connections carried the potential for catastrophic betrayal. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Tiberius met her eyes, and she saw there a struggle between the man who had found unexpected happiness in her company and the emperor who bore responsibility for the stability of an empire. "Now," he said, "we must decide whether what we have found together is worth the risks it entails. For both of us." The hours that followed unfolded with the precise choreography of a military campaign. While Tiberius and Cassia spoke in hushed tones in the hidden chamber, teams of Praetorian guards moved through the darkened streets of Rome like silent shadows, following lists that Commander Brutus had prepared with meticulous care. Senator Cassius was taken from his villa just after midnight, roused from sleep by soldiers who gave him barely enough time to dress before escorting him to a secure location within the palace complex. His co-conspirators, 3 provincial governors who had been visiting Rome for the winter season, 2 ambitious junior senators, and a handful of wealthy merchants who had been financing the plot, were arrested simultaneously across the city. By dawn, the conspiracy that had threatened to plunge Rome into civil war had been effectively neutralized. But for Tiberius and Cassia, the immediate crisis had only clarified the deeper challenges they faced. "I could arrange safe passage for you to any province in the empire," Tiberius said, as they sat across from each other in the small chamber, both of them aware that they might be having their final conversation. "A new identity, sufficient resources to establish yourself anywhere you choose to go. You would be free to continue your practice without fear of political retribution." Cassia studied his face in the flickering lamplight, noting the careful control that kept his expression neutral. Despite the pain, she could see in his storm-grey eyes. After months of watching that control gradually soften, seeing it reassert itself so completely felt like watching a door slam shut between them. "And what of you?" she asked. "What happens to the emperor who discovered that even medical treatment can become a political liability?" "I return to what I was before. A ruler who trusts no one completely and allows no one close enough to be used against him. It is, perhaps, the safer path for everyone involved." The resignation in his voice broke something inside her chest. Here was a man who had briefly allowed himself to hope for human connection, only to have that hope twisted into another potential weapon by those who sought to destroy him. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. "There is another option," she said quietly. He looked at her with surprise, having expected her to accept his offer of exile with relief. "What do you mean?" "We could fight for what we have found together. not by hiding from the political realities, but by confronting them directly. She leaned forward, her brown eyes intense with conviction. You are the Emperor of Rome. You have the power to reshape the rules that govern these situations. Cassia, you don't understand the forces we would be opposing. The senatorial class, the established families, the entire system of alliances and obligations that holds the empire together. They all depend on maintaining certain expectations about imperial behavior. Perhaps it's time those expectations were challenged. Her voice carried the same quiet determination he had observed when she treated particularly difficult cases. You have spent 7 years proving that you can rule effectively despite bearing the mark of personal tragedy. Why should you not also prove that an emperor can find happiness without compromising his responsibilities? Tiberius stood and began pacing the small room, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences. What she proposed was not entirely unprecedented. Other emperors had defied convention in their personal lives, but always at a cost, and often with results that proved disastrous for both the rulers and their chosen companions. The risks, he began, are considerable, she interrupted, but so are the rewards, and more importantly, so are the consequences of surrender. She rose to face him directly. If you send me away now, you confirm their belief that you can be controlled through fear of scandal. You give them a weapon they will use again and again against anyone who might offer you genuine support or affection. The truth of this observation hit him like a physical blow. His brother's betrayal had taught him to guard against treachery from within his inner circle, but he had not fully understood how isolation itself could become a vulnerability. A ruler who could not trust anyone completely was a ruler who could be manipulated by those willing to exploit his fundamental loneliness. What exactly are you proposing? He asked, though part of him already knew what she would say. Marry me. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge thrown down before an enemy army. Simple in their directness, revolutionary in their implications. A healer from the Subura cannot become Empress of Rome, he said automatically, echoing objections that had been drilled into him since childhood. Why not? Because tradition dictates that emperors must marry for political advantage rather than personal affection. Because the people of Rome cannot accept that their ruler might choose love over dynasty. She stepped closer to him, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes. Or because you have been convinced that happiness is incompatible with effective leadership. Tiberius found himself remembering conversations from their early sessions, when she had spoken of plants that thrived when given proper care, of the difference between survival and flourishing. For 7 years he had survived as emperor, but when had he last truly flourished as a human being? The Senate would revolt, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Let them. You have just crushed a conspiracy that included some of their most prominent members. The rest will be too concerned with their own survival to mount effective opposition. She reached out and touched his scarred cheek with infinite gentleness. Besides, you are not asking their permission. You are informing them of your decision. The touch of her hand against his scar, the mark that had defined his isolation for so many years, sent warmth racing through him. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine what she described, a marriage based on genuine affection rather than political calculation, a partnership that strengthened rather than constrained him, a future that held the possibility of true companionship. There would be conditions, he said slowly, his imperial mind already working through the practical considerations. Safeguards to protect both you and the stability of the empire. Name them. A formal adoption into a patrician family to give you the bloodline that Roman law requires for imperial marriage. A gradual introduction to court society to demonstrate that you can navigate the political complexities of palace life. And most importantly, ironclad legal protections to ensure that any children of our union are recognized as legitimate heirs to the throne. As he spoke, his voice grew stronger, more decisive. The emperor, who had built his reputation on careful planning and strategic thinking, was reasserting himself, but now in service of hope rather than mere survival. "And in return?" Cassia asked. "In return, you accept the burden of becoming a public figure, with all the scrutiny and criticism that entails. You understand that every word you speak, every action you take, will be analyzed for political significance. You acknowledge that our marriage will be used by our enemies as evidence of poor judgment, and by our friends as proof of our humanity." She was quiet for a long moment, considering the magnitude of what he was asking. The simple life she had built for herself would disappear entirely, replaced by the complex demands of imperial responsibility. Yet as she looked at this man who had shown her such trust and vulnerability, who had allowed her to see past the imperial mask to the wounded soul beneath, she knew that her choice was already made. "I accept," she said simply. They stood looking at each other in the lamplight, both aware that they had just committed themselves to a course of action that would reshape not only their own lives, but potentially the future of the empire itself. The risks were enormous, the opposition certain to be fierce, and the outcome far from guaranteed. Yet for the first time since his brother's dagger had carved both flesh and spirit, Tiberius felt something more powerful than fear driving his decisions. Whatever storms lay ahead, he would not face them alone. "Then we begin immediately," he said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command married to absolute resolve. "By dawn, all of Rome will know that their emperor has chosen to marry for love rather than convenience. And we will let them decide whether that makes him weaker or stronger." As if summoned by his words, the sound of footsteps echoed in the corridor outside their chamber. Commander Brutus appeared in the doorway, his expression grim but satisfied. "Caesar, the last of the conspirators, has been taken into custody. The immediate threat has been neutralized." "Excellent. And now, Commander, we have a wedding to plan." The announcement came at the third hour, delivered simultaneously to the Senate, the Praetorian Guard, and the people of Rome through proclamations posted throughout the city. By imperial decree, Tiberius Lucianus would wed Cassia Lucilla in 7 days' time, following her formal adoption into the ancient patrician family of the Corneli, and her elevation to the rank befitting an imperial bride. The reaction was immediate and explosive. In the Senate House, elderly senators who had served under 3 different emperors clutched their togas and spoke in hushed tones of precedent and propriety. Senator Marcus Brutus, still reeling from the revelation of Cassius's conspiracy, found himself in the unprecedented position of defending an emperor's personal choices while privately questioning his political wisdom. "A healer from the Subura," muttered Senator Quintus Fabius, shaking his grey head in disbelief. "What message does this send to our allies?" "To our enemies. That the Emperor of Rome chooses wives from the common rabble? The Emperor's choice of bride is his own affair," Brutus replied carefully, though his own doubts echoed through his words. "We have more pressing concerns, like ensuring that the conspiracy's roots have been fully exposed." But throughout Rome's taverns and marketplaces, the reaction was markedly different. Common citizens who had heard whispered stories of the scarred emperor's loneliness found themselves oddly moved by the news. Here was a ruler who had chosen one of their own, who had looked beyond noble bloodlines to find companionship with a woman who healed the sick and tended the poor. "She's a good woman." "That Cassia," said Marcus the baker, whose wife had been among her patients, "delivered my youngest boy when the midwife couldn't come, never asked for more payment than we could afford. If the emperor's got sense enough to see her worth, maybe he's got more sense than the senators give him credit for." In her modest dwelling in the Subura, Cassia sat surrounded by imperial functionaries who had descended upon her home like a well-organized storm. Seamstresses measured her for wedding garments of silk and gold. Court officials explained the intricate protocols she would need to master. Legal scribes prepared documents for her adoption that would transform her overnight from a common citizen to a member of Rome's most distinguished family. Through it all, She maintained an outward calm that belied the turbulence in her heart. The woman who had once been satisfied with tending her small garden and healing neighborhood ailments was about to become the most closely watched person in the empire, second only to Tiberius himself. The emperor has requested that you be moved to secure quarters within the palace immediately, explained Claudia Octavia, a formidable matron of impeccable lineage who had been assigned to oversee Cassia's transformation. For your safety, you understand. There are always those who oppose change, regardless of its merit. That evening, as Cassia took her last walk through the narrow streets of the Subura, she found herself acutely aware of everything she was leaving behind. The familiar sounds of families settling in for the night, the scent of cooking fires and evening meals, the easy anonymity of being just another face in the crowd. All of this would disappear the moment she became the emperor's bride. Yet when she thought of Tiberius, of the trust he had shown her, the vulnerability he had allowed her to see, the courage it had taken for him to choose love over political convenience, she felt her resolve strengthen. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Meanwhile, in the palace complex, Tiberius met with his closest advisors to address the practical implications of his decision. Commander Brutus outlined new security protocols. Maximus presented revised schedules that would accommodate the presence of an empress. Treasury officials calculated the costs of an imperial wedding that would need to project both dignity and legitimacy. The remaining senators are requesting a formal audience, Maximus reported. They wish to express their concerns about the political ramifications of your marriage choice. Let them express whatever concerns they wish, Tiberius replied with calm authority. But make it clear that this is an announcement, not a negotiation. I am not seeking their approval for my personal decisions. As the preparations continued through the night, both bride and groom found themselves facing the same fundamental question. Could love truly flourish under the weight of imperial responsibility? Or would the demands of empire ultimately crush the tender connection they had discovered? The answer would come in 7 days, when a scarred emperor and a healer from the common districts would stand before all of Rome and declare their commitment to each other. But first, they would have to survive the storm of opposition that was already beginning to gather like storm clouds on the horizon. The wedding dawned clear and cold, with winter sunlight streaming through the tall windows of the imperial palace like spears of gold-piercing crystal air. Rome had not seen such ceremony in a generation. The marriage of an emperor was always a momentous occasion. But this union carried symbolic weight that extended far beyond the joining of two lives. In her chambers, Cassia stood motionless as servants draped her in silk the color of deep wine, fastened pearls at her throat that had been worn by empresses for 2 centuries, and arranged her hair in the elaborate style befitting her new station. The woman who looked back at her from the polished bronze mirror was almost unrecognizable, transformed from humble healer to imperial bride by the alchemy of wealth and ceremony. Yet when Claudia Octavia placed the traditional crown of myrtle leaves upon her head, Cassia felt the weight of more than mere gold and jewels. She was accepting responsibility not just for her own happiness, but for the political stability of an empire, the personal redemption of a man who had known too much betrayal, and the hopes of common people who saw in her elevation a validation of their own worth. "You look magnificent," Claudia observed with satisfaction. Worthy of Caesar's choice. In his own chambers, Tiberius was undergoing his own transformation. The imperial toga worn for state occasions was purple silk, shot through with gold thread, so richly decorated that it seemed to catch and hold light like a living thing. The ceremonial laurel crown of emperors rested heavily upon his brow, its weight a familiar reminder of the burdens he carried. But today, something was different. Commander Brutus, who had attended countless state functions with his emperor, noticed it immediately. The tension that usually preceded public appearances had been replaced by something approaching peace. The man preparing to wed was no longer the isolated ruler who had hidden his scarred face from potential brides, but someone who had found the courage to believe in love despite its risks. "The guests have assembled, Caesar," Brutus reported. "The Senate in full attendance, representatives from every major province, allied kings and governors. Rome's elite witness your happiness." The great hall of the palace had been transformed into a temple of celebration. Columns were wreathed in olive branches and winter roses. Golden braziers filled the air with the scent of precious incense. At the far end of the hall, before an altar draped in imperial purple, the high priest of Jupiter waited in his ceremonial robes to conduct the sacred rituals that would bind emperor and healer in marriage. As the assembled guests rose to their feet, Tiberius entered the hall with measured steps that carried the authority of absolute power, tempered by newfound vulnerability. Every eye was upon him, some measuring, some calculating, some genuinely hoping for his happiness. He walked alone, as emperors always did, but for the first time in 7 years, he did not feel alone. The music began, lyres and flutes playing melodies that had accompanied imperial weddings since the days of Augustus. Through the great doors at the opposite end of the hall came Cassia, escorted by members of her newly adopted family, but walking with the dignity that was entirely her own. She moved through the assembled nobility of Rome with quiet grace, neither overawed by their magnificence nor intimidated by their scrutiny. When nervous glances fell upon her simple origins, she met them with steady brown eyes that spoke of competence earned through years of service to others. When whispered comments questioned her worthiness, she answered with posture that reflected not arrogance, but unshakable self-possession. Halfway down the aisle, their eyes met across the sea of watching faces. In that moment, everything else, the political calculations, the social expectations, the centuries of precedent that their union challenged, fell away. There was only a man and a woman who had found in each other something worth fighting for, worth risking everything to protect. As they met before the altar, Tiberius extended his hand to her with a gesture that was both imperial command and personal invitation. Cassia placed her hand in his without hesitation, and together they turned to face the priest who would speak the ancient words that would make them husband and wife. "Citizens of Rome," the high priest intoned, his voice carrying to every corner of the great hall, "we gather today to witness the sacred union of Tiberius Lucianus, Emperor of Rome, and Cassia Lucilla, daughter of the house of Corneli. Let all who hear these words know that this marriage is blessed by the gods and sanctified by the traditions of our ancestors." The ceremonial questions were asked and answered. Vows were spoken that bound their lives together before gods and mortals alike. When the priest finally pronounced them married, the assembled guests erupted in applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of the palace. But for Tiberius and Cassia, the most important moment came not during the grand ceremony, but in the silence that followed, when he lifted her veil and looked upon the face of the woman who had chosen to share his impossible life. In her eyes, he saw reflected not the scarred emperor that Rome feared and respected, but simply the man she loved. When they kissed to seal their union, it was witnessed by senators and kings, by representatives of every corner of the empire. Yet for those two people in that moment, they might have been alone in the world. 3 years later, Emperor Tiberius stood once again at the window of his private chambers. But the man who watched the sun rise over Rome bore little resemblance to the isolated ruler who had once counted loneliness among his greatest burdens. The scar still marked his face, would always mark his face, but it no longer defined him. Time and love had transformed what was once a symbol of betrayal into simply another part of his history, no more significant than any other line the years had carved upon his features. Beside him, Empress Cassia held their infant son, Marcus Tiberius, named for both his father and the centurion whose memory had first brought his parents together. The child had his mother's brown eyes and his father's determined chin, and when he smiled, which was often, both parents saw in that expression the promise of a future free from the shadows that had haunted their own paths to happiness. The morning reports, Caesar. Maximus appeared in the doorway with his usual efficiency, but even the formal secretary could not entirely suppress his smile when he saw the domestic scene before him. 3 years of serving an emperor who had found personal happiness had transformed the entire atmosphere of the palace from barely contained tension to something approaching genuine warmth. Let me guess, Tiberius said without turning from the window. The grain shipments from Egypt are on schedule. The provincial governors are squabbling over tax assessments, and Senator Brutus has another proposal for public works projects that will benefit his constituents. Remarkably accurate, Caesar. Though I should add that the delegation from Gaul has arrived early for their scheduled audience, and your wife has requested time this afternoon to discuss her plans for the new hospital in the Subura. Cassia looked up from their son with the slight smile that her husband had come to treasure above all imperial honors. Her transformation from humble healer to empress had been remarkable to witness. She had mastered the complex protocols of court life while never losing the essential qualities that had first drawn Tiberius to her. She still maintained her medical practice, though now it took the form of imperial patronage for healing centers throughout the empire rather than individual consultations in narrow streets. The hospital project is proceeding well, she said, settling Marcus in his cradle before moving to join her husband at the window. The architects believe we can complete construction before the winter rains. It will be the largest medical facility in Rome, with separate wings for different types of ailments and training rooms for physicians from across the empire. The project had been her idea, a way to use her position to expand access to healing for people who could never afford the services of court physicians. Like many of her initiatives, it had initially faced opposition from traditional elements in the Senate, who questioned whether an empress should involve herself so directly in matters of public health. But the undeniable success of her programs had gradually won over even her harshest critics. The people love her, Maximus observed, consulting his notes. The latest reports from the city prefect indicate that Empress Cassia's popularity ratings exceed even your own, Caesar, particularly among the common citizens. Tiberius chuckled, remembering his early fears that marrying beneath his station would undermine his authority with the masses. Instead, Cassia's origins had proved to be one of their greatest political assets. The people of Rome saw in their empress someone who understood their struggles, who had risen from their ranks through merit rather than birth, and who used her elevated position to improve their lives rather than simply enjoy its privileges. What news of our former conspirators? Tiberius asked, his tone more curious than concerned. The men who had plotted his assassination had been tried and convicted, but rather than ordering their execution, he had chosen exile, a decision that had surprised many, but proved politically astute. Dead martyrs could inspire future conspiracies. Living exiles in distant provinces served as reminders of the consequences of treason while demonstrating imperial mercy. Cassius sends regular reports from his estate in Sardinia, Maximus replied. He seems to have developed an interest in olive cultivation. The other conspirators are similarly domesticated by their circumstances. The former senator's transformation from ambitious plotter to gentleman farmer had become something of a joke among Rome's political class. Few things were more effective at discouraging conspiracy than the example of former conspirators condemned to lives of rural irrelevance. As the morning progressed with its familiar rhythm of meetings and decisions, audiences and correspondence, Tiberius found himself reflecting on the changes that 3 years had brought. The empire ran as smoothly as ever, perhaps more smoothly, given that his improved disposition had led to better relationships with provincial governors and allied kings. The Senate, after its initial resistance to his marriage choice, had largely accepted Cassia's presence and even come to value her perspective on matters affecting common citizens. Most significantly, The constant undercurrent of loneliness that had shaped his reign for 7 years had simply disappeared. Where once he had made decisions in isolation, he now had a partner whose judgment he trusted completely. Where once his private hours had been filled with brooding and regret, he now had a family that gave meaning to all his public responsibilities. That evening, as they sat together in their private garden, the same space where their friendship had first deepened into love, Cassia watched her husband playing with their son while the sun set behind the olive trees. The emperor, who had once believed himself unworthy of human affection, now delighted in making silly faces to provoke infant giggles, and the contrast between his public dignity and private playfulness never failed to make her smile. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, the question that had been unspoken between them for 3 years finally finding voice. Choosing love over political convenience? Tiberius looked up from Marcus, who had fallen asleep in his arms, with the complete trust that only children can display. His storm-grey eyes met his wife's brown ones across the gathering dusk, and in them she saw the answer even before he spoke. "Never," he said simply. "Not once, not ever. You taught me that the greatest strength is not the ability to stand alone, but the wisdom to choose the right person to stand beside. Sometimes the loneliest person in the room really is the one everyone fears to approach. Sometimes the most powerful man in the world really is the most heartbroken. But sometimes, just sometimes, love finds a way to heal even the deepest wounds, and two people discover that together they are stronger than either could ever be alone."